What you see here might look like a regular building, but it's not. One architect is reimagining the way we see vacant storefronts and giving them a new life with materials that already exist without adding anything extra to landfills to make this tech hub that provides education to underserved kids. How? Stay tuned because that's what we're checking out in this week's episode. How do building materials contribute to the climate crisis? What types of materials are being used and how do they get turned into new items? To find out the answers, we'll be talking to a group that's upcycling all of this into this. This is Danish Karani. He's made it his mission to revitalize abandoned retail spaces and uses upcycled materials to turn them into buildings like this STEM lab in Oakland, California.
I've been designing buildings for such a long time now, and it always breaks my heart when I see construction sites where a building is being demolished because I know that all of that rubble, all of that furniture, all of those walls, all of those lighting fixtures, all of that is going to landfill. And so when I was designing Code Next and any of the projects that I do, I really pay attention to the materials that are being used and what type of impact they're going to have on society.
In 2016, Danish partnered with Google to open Code Next, a lab to teach kids about computer science and tech, as well as cultivate the next generation of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous tech leaders. So how does a vacant building use upcycled materials?
When I go into these vacant and abandoned spaces, there's still some stuff left over, and I always try to figure out, can we make use of this? Can we repurpose this? Can we upcycle it into something that'll be useful for what we're trying to build?
He partners with local builders and fabricators who will recycle and upcycle the items for the new building.
Well, if you look at the architecture and construction industry, there's a huge environmental footprint from the work that we do. It's not just in the energy use of the buildings, but it's also the embodied carbon and the emissions from transporting materials.
Code Next is a 3,000 square foot lab built inside an unused Oakland storefront. The space features industrial-looking floors, exposed ceiling, and open displays of tools and projects. Around the building, you'll find countertops made from upcycled cardboard and metal scraps from factory floors. Danish doesn't just focus on upcycled materials, he also researches how air quality and lighting affect students.
Especially when they're in their teenage years. For these kids, their circadian rhythms start to get a little off kilter at that age. And so at the Code Next lab, I've put in tuned lighting that's the right temperature that helps them reset their circadian rhythms. In the HVAC systems, I've put a filter, it's called a MERV 15 filter, which filters out a lot of the contaminants and particles that might be in the air that lead to asthma, which is like one of the biggest reasons that kids miss school days in the US. Thinking about taking care of them physically so that they can perform mentally and intellectually and creatively.
Danish says the process for each space typically takes around 6 to 8 months, and if the space were to close, the materials would be disassembled and reused.
My mission as an architect is to teach people around the world about the value of our surroundings, how that affects your mood and your behaviors and your mindset. Right now, I'm really focused on creating education spaces and showing people the power of architecture and education.
It all began in 2015 when it was discovered that just approximately 3% of Google's workforce was Black or Latinx. Similar data was found at other tech companies too. Silicon Valley was forced to recognize that people of color were being denied the chance to be a part of the tech sector.
This was problematic because you've got a bunch of people making technology for all of us to use, but they don't necessarily look like us, they don't experience the same problems as us, they don't come from the same backgrounds as us. So Google decided back then in 2015 that, of course, one way to improve the diversity in Silicon Valley and in tech is to change hiring practices. But another way is to actually go downstream to where students are being precluded from even going into STEM fields and majors.
Danish and Google opened the first Code Next lab in 2016, which offered free computer science classes for 8th to 12th graders after school and on the weekends.
So Google decided, hey, actually, it would be great if we could target students when they're younger, give them opportunities to fall in love with STEM, have access to mentors and equipment and resources in computer science, and just give them a leg up so that when they are thinking about college, they might actually major in STEM, and then that might lead them to end up working in Silicon Valley one day. And so I worked with them to design that experience and that place, the Code Next lab, where this could be possible. Like, what type of environment can we wrap around them so that they do start to study STEM?
For Danish, this work is important because it hits close to home.
I've seen it firsthand with my own family when we immigrated here, and just how education's helped me and my family just make a better life for ourselves. And so I think when we invest in education, that's essentially what we're saying, is that we believe in people.
Everything in the lab is designed to encourage students to be creators, with a coding room, makerspace, design studio, and communal areas. Students have access to 3D printers, laser cutters, cutting machines, soldering irons, robotic tools, and more. So why is this mission so important to Danish? Constructing new building produces more waste that goes to landfills. Construction can cause both air and water pollution. It can expose construction workers to harmful chemicals and allow for chemical discharge into surface water. New construction can also harm wildlife by clearing vegetation and changing the surface of land, which can increase runoff and soil erosion. The Oakland Code Next Lab lessens many of these issues by using a vacant storefront as a base and looking for ways to introduce used and upcycled materials. So far, Code Next has impacted the lives of more than 2,500 students and has provided them with a pathway to higher education. According to Code Next, 92% of 12th graders who graduate the Code Next program attend college and higher education institutions. Approximately 88% have pursued STEM majors. In addition to building the Code Next Lab, Danish has reused and repurposed strip malls, shopping centers, offices, outdated campuses, and warehouses for educational use. Currently, Danish is writing a book on architecture and its impact on our lives. He's also uplifting marginalized communities with designs like a school for happiness in India, a rehabilitation center offering men an alternative to prison in Berkeley, California, and a coding lab for Black girls in New York City.
When I am creating schools and learning centers and places for people to develop themselves, I also want to make sure that just because I'm helping this community over here, I'm not harming another community over there.
Danish hopes that construction companies take note and realize that building something beautiful and sustainable doesn't have to cost a fortune.
A lot of people think, to do something well or to do something sustainable, it has to cost more. It's actually not true. And it just requires some creativity, and you could have something that is not only beautiful, extremely functional, it's also affordable, and it's good for the planet.
If you want to help support Danish's work, he has a research fund that he said is looking into the built environment, how it can improve our lives, and how we can create places that improve our health and well-being. Danish encourages designers to start looking at fabricators and manufacturers who can make products in a sustainable way.
We all share this planet. We all want to live here. We all want our future generations to live and thrive here. So it's important that we're all taking care of it together.
What do you think? Have you come across abandoned buildings? Have you upcycled anything? What will you do if you encountered abandoned construction materials? Let us know in the comments below.